At the top of a hill in Millbrook, New York, stand the remains of something that was once magnificent, Halcyon Hall. The name comes from the Greek word halcyon, meaning peace, tranquility, better times, a name that promised refuge, a name that over time would become a cruel irony. This Gilded Age mansion was built in 1893 as a luxury hotel for New York's wealthy elite. But in 1941, its marble halls and ornate rooms were transformed into something entirely different, a private psychiatric hospital. What happens when a symbol of wealth becomes a prison? When architecture designed for comfort is used for confinement? This is the story of Halcyon Hall and the lives silenced within its walls. To understand what Halcyon Hall became, we must first see what it was. We must travel back in time to an era of opulence and excess, an era when America's wealthiest families were building their empires and the gap between rich and poor had never been wider. We are in 1890. Gilded Age America is in full bloom. The Rockefellers are dominating the oil industry. At the top of a hill in Millbrook, New York, stand the remains of something that was once magnificent, Halcyon Hall. The name comes from the Greek word halcyon, meaning peace, tranquility, better times, a name that promised refuge, a name that over time would become a cruel irony. This Gilded Age mansion was built in 1893 as a luxury hotel for New York's wealthy elite. But in 1941, its marble halls and ornate rooms were transformed into something entirely different, a private psychiatric hospital. What happens when a symbol of wealth becomes a prison? When architecture designed for comfort is used for confinement? This is the story of Halcyon Hall and the lives silenced within its walls. To understand what Halcyon Hall became, we must first see what it was. We must travel back in time to an era of opulence and excess, an era when America's wealthiest families were building their empires and the gap between rich and poor had never been wider. We are in 1890. Gilded Age America is in full bloom. The Rockefellers are dominating the oil industry. The Vanderbilts control the railroads. The Astors own vast stretches of Manhattan real estate. These families and dozens like them are the wealthiest people in the country, building empires that will last generations. And with this wealth comes a new industry, luxury resorts. Places where the rich could escape the suffocating heat of New York City summers, places where they could see and be seen away from the crowds and chaos of urban life. The Catskills, the Adirondacks, the Hudson Valley, these regions become dotted with grand hotels and private estates. In Millbrook, New York, just 90 kilometers from the city, businessman H.J. Davison sees an opportunity. The location is perfect. High on a hill with sweeping views of the Hudson Valley, close enough to New York to be convenient, far enough to feel like an escape. In 1893, he builds Halcyon Hall, a 5-story resort hotel with 200 rooms designed in the Romanesque Revival style that was popular among America's elite at the time. The structure is breathtaking, red brick imported from kilns in Pennsylvania. Towers with slate roofs that catch the afternoon sun, wide verandas overlooking the Hudson Valley where guests could take their evening cocktails and watch the sunset over the mountains. Inside, no expense is spared. There are ballrooms with ornate plaster ceilings, each rosette and cornice handcrafted by European artisans. Italian marble floors, polished to a mirror shine. Hand-carved fireplaces in every major room, each one unique. Stained glass imported from Europe, depicting pastoral scenes and classical mythology. The dining room could seat 300 guests. The library held thousands of leather-bound volumes. There were smoking rooms for the men, parlors for the women, billiard rooms, card rooms, music rooms. Halcyon Hall is not just a hotel, it is a sanctuary, a place where America's elite can relax, socialize, and forget the worries of urban life. A place where business deals are made over cigars and brandy, where marriages are arranged between powerful families, where the future of American industry is quietly decided. There is even a golf course on the grounds, one of the first in the region. Croquet lawns, tennis courts, stables with horses for riding through the countryside. For a brief, shining moment, Halcyon Hall is everything its name promises: peace, tranquility, better times. But sanctuaries are fragile, and the world is about to change in ways no one can predict. The Gilded Age did not last forever. Nothing ever does. The first cracks appear in 1907. A banking panic sweeps the country. Stock prices plummet. Businesses fail. Even the wealthy feel the pinch. Summer vacations are postponed. Reservations are canceled. Halcyon Hall closes its doors as a hotel that same year. The timing couldn't be worse. The building is only 14 years old, barely middle-aged for a structure built to last centuries. For a few years, there are attempts to revive it. New investors come and go. Plans are drawn up and abandoned, but nothing sticks. The glory days are over. Then comes World War I. Young men who should be playing tennis and golf are dying in European trenches. The mood of the country changes. Frivolous luxury feels inappropriate, almost obscene. The 20s bring a temporary revival of wealth, but Halcyon Hall remains closed. The building sits on its hilltop, windows dark, doors locked. Local children begin to tell stories about it, ghost stories, tales of strange lights in the windows at night. And then 1929, the stock market crash, the beginning of the Great Depression. Fortunes that took generations to build are wiped out overnight. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, even the Rockefellers see their wealth shrink dramatically. The wealthy are no longer traveling to summer resorts. They are fighting to survive, selling assets, laying off servants. Some are even losing their homes. For more than 32 years, Halcyon Hall sits abandoned. Rain seeps through the roofs, staining those beautiful plaster ceilings. Ice expands in the cracks of the marble floors, breaking them apart. Windows shatter in winter storms. The stained glass, so carefully imported from Europe, begins to fall out pane by pane. Nature begins to reclaim what was taken from it. Vines crawl up the brick walls, trees sprout in the gutters, birds nest in the ballrooms, raccoons and possums make homes in the grand parlors. The building becomes a local curiosity, a landmark of a bygone era. Teenagers dare each other to break in at night. Vagrants seek shelter in its abandoned rooms. The structure slowly, inexorably, falls into ruin.
But in 1941, someone sees potential in that silent ruin. An organization called Bennett School for Girls, a prestigious private college with a campus nearby, purchases the property. The price is remarkably low. The building has been abandoned so long that the owners are simply glad to be rid of it. But Bennett School doesn't buy Halcyon Hall for students. They have other plans. Plans that will transform the building once again. Plans that will give it a new purpose, darker than anyone could have imagined when it was first built. In partnership with medical investors, they transform Halcyon Hall into something new, the Bennett College Sanatorium. The name sounds pleasant enough. Sanatoriums were popular in that era, places where people went to recover from tuberculosis, to rest their nerves, to escape the stresses of modern life. But this is different. This is a psychiatric facility. Later, they dropped the pretense entirely. The Bennett College Sanatorium becomes Halcyon Hall's psychiatric hospital. The mansion built for peace would now house those whom society deemed disturbed, unstable, dangerous, or simply inconvenient. Transforming a luxury hotel into a psychiatric hospital requires more than just changing the name on the door. It requires reimagining every space, redesigning every room, turning elegance into efficiency, comfort into control. The grand ballrooms, where orchestras once played and couples waltzed under crystal chandeliers, are divided by brick walls. One ballroom becomes 4 wards, then 8, then 16 small rooms. Spacious hotel rooms, designed for comfort and privacy, become narrow cells, just enough room for a bed, a small table, perhaps a chair. The ornate moldings are painted over with institutional gray or green paint. Those decorative windows, with their views of the Hudson Valley, are covered with metal bars, heavy bars bolted into the brick. The message is clear: this is not a place you can leave whenever you want. Doors now have locks on the outside, not the simple hotel locks that guests could open from within, but heavy institutional locks that only staff can open. Some doors have small windows at eye level, so nurses can look in without entering. Others have no windows at all. The beautiful Italian marble floors are covered with cheap linoleum, easier to clean, less echo when someone is screaming. The hand-carved fireplaces are bricked up. Fire is dangerous in an institution. Everything that can be broken, used as a weapon, or used to harm oneself must be removed or secured. This is the pattern of 1940s and 50s American psychiatry. Isolation is considered treatment. Silence is considered healing. Control is considered care. The underlying philosophy is simple. The mentally ill are fundamentally different from normal people. They cannot be trusted. They cannot be reasoned with. They must be separated from society, for their own good and for everyone else's safety. But what really happened inside those walls? What was daily life like for the people who lived there? What were the treatments like, the rules, the routines? Medical records from that era are scarce and often destroyed. Privacy laws, ironically, make it harder to understand what happened in these institutions. Patient files are sealed or shredded. Staff rarely kept detailed records, and survivors, when they spoke at all, were often dismissed as unreliable. But we know some things. We can piece together fragments from various sources: court records from commitment hearings, newspaper articles from the era, architectural plans that show how the building was modified, and most importantly, testimonies from survivors of similar institutions across the country. Halcyon Hall was a private institution. This is crucial to understanding what happened there. Private psychiatric hospitals operated differently from state institutions. They catered to wealthy families who could afford to pay for discretion, and they had less oversight, less regulation, and far more discretion over who they admitted and why. State hospitals were overcrowded, underfunded nightmares, but at least they required some form of legal process for commitment, a hearing, a judge, some kind of official diagnosis. Private institutions like Halcyon Hall could admit someone with little more than a doctor's signature and a family's request. And once someone was inside, getting out required the agreement of both the doctors and the family paying the bills. This created a system ripe for abuse, and abuse, we now know, was common. Women were frequently committed for hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis that could mean almost anything: depression, anxiety, mood swings, anger, even just having opinions that differed from their husbands or fathers. Melancholia was another common diagnosis. What we would now recognize as clinical depression was seen as a character flaw, a weakness that needed to be corrected through discipline and isolation. But many women were committed for things that weren't illnesses at all: for inappropriate behavior, for refusing to marry the man their family chose, for having an affair, for wanting a divorce, for drinking or smoking, for being too independent, too outspoken, too difficult. Men were sent for alcoholism, which was seen as a moral failing rather than a disease, for post-war depression and trauma, what we now call PTSD, but was then called shell shock or battle fatigue, for refusing to follow family expectations, to take over the family business, to marry and have children. In many cases, wealthy families used institutions like Halcyon Hall not for treatment, but to hide family members who embarrassed the family name. An inconvenient divorce that might cause scandal in society circles, a potential public outburst that could damage the family's reputation, a daughter who refused to marry, who wanted to pursue her own career, who was simply too independent for the era's expectations.
The institution became a convenient solution, a way to make problems disappear behind locked doors and barred windows. And once inside, getting out could be impossible. Think about it. You are committed by your family. The doctors work for your family, who are paying the bills. If you protest, if you insist you're not sick, that's seen as proof of your illness. Denial is a symptom. Resistance is a symptom. The more you fight, the more you prove you belong there. You could be model patient, following every rule, taking every medication, but if your family doesn't want you back, if they're comfortable with you being out of sight and out of mind, you might stay for years, decades, forever. There are documented cases across America of people who spent their entire adult lives in psychiatric institutions, admitted as teenagers for minor behavioral issues, and never released. Their families forgot about them, or perhaps more accurately, their families chose to forget about them. Routine was everything at Halcyon Hall. Structure, predictability, control. These were the foundations of institutional psychiatry in the mid-20th century. Every day was the same, exactly the same. Variation was dangerous, spontaneity was discouraged. Life became a series of scheduled activities, each one carefully timed and supervised. 6 a.m., patients are awakened by nurses making their rounds. No sleeping in, no matter how little sleep you got the night before, no matter how the medications affected you, everyone is awake at 6 a.m. Supervised bathing follows, not because patients can't bathe themselves, but because privacy is not something you're entitled to in an institution. Everything is supervised, everything is watched. Uniform clothing is distributed, not your own clothes brought from home, institutional uniforms, the same for everyone, gray or white or pale blue, shapeless, sexless. Another way of erasing individuality, of making everyone the same. 7 a.m., breakfast in silence in the old dining room, now transformed into an institutional cafeteria. Long tables, benches instead of chairs, plates that can't be broken, forks and spoons, but no knives, and silence. Talking during meals is discouraged or forbidden. Silence is easier to control. The food is institutional, bland, cheap, sufficient for nutrition, but designed for efficiency and cost-cutting, not enjoyment. Everything is soft, overcooked, easy to eat quickly. Meals are scheduled down to the minute. 20 minutes to eat breakfast, then the plates are cleared whether you're finished or not. 8 a.m. to noon, occupational therapy. This sounds beneficial, therapeutic, but in practice it often meant manual labor. Keeping patients busy was considered treatment in itself. Idle hands were dangerous. For women, this meant sewing, making linens for the hospital, mending uniforms, repetitive, tedious work. For men, it might mean gardening, maintaining the grounds that were once manicured lawns for wealthy guests, or workshop tasks, simple carpentry, painting, basic maintenance. The theory was that structured activity would restore mental health, that learning to focus on tasks would somehow cure whatever had led to commitment. But there was also an economic incentive. Free labor from patients helped keep costs down. Lunch at noon. The same routine as breakfast: silence, speed, supervision. Afternoons might bring more occupational therapy or group sessions where patients sat in circles and were encouraged to talk about their feelings, their problems, their families. But these sessions were often led by staff with minimal training, and anything you said could be used as evidence that you weren't ready for release. Dinner at 5 p.m., evening medication rounds at 6 p.m. Patients lined up to receive their pills, their injections, their liquid medications. No one refused medication. Refusal had consequences. By 8 p.m., everyone was expected to be in their rooms. Lights out at 9 p.m. And then, in the darkness, the sounds that haunted every psychiatric institution. Crying, screaming, talking to oneself, the shuffle of nurses making their rounds, the jingle of keys, the sounds of locks turning. But the real treatment, the interventions that were supposed to cure patients, those were different. Those were what separated psychiatric institutions from simple warehouses for inconvenient people. In the 1940s and 50s, psychiatry was experimenting aggressively. The field was desperate for treatments that worked. Psychoanalysis, the talking cure, was too slow and too expensive for institutions. They needed something faster, more dramatic, more definitive. Electroshock therapy, or electroconvulsive therapy as it's now called, was one of the most popular treatments. The theory was that inducing a seizure through electrical current would somehow reset the brain, curing depression, psychosis, mania. In practice, it was brutal. Early electroshock had no anesthesia, no muscle relaxants. Patients were awake and fully conscious as electricity coursed through their brains. The seizures were so violent that patients often broke teeth, bit through their tongues, fractured bones. The memory loss was devastating. Hours, days, weeks of memories simply erased. Some patients lost years of their lives. They couldn't remember their children's names. They couldn't remember their own weddings. They couldn't remember why they were in the hospital in the first place. Lobotomies were another popular treatment, especially in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The surgeon would insert a sharp instrument through the eye socket or through holes drilled in the skull, then sever connections in the frontal lobe of the brain. The results were permanent. Patients became docile, emotionless, childlike. They lost initiative, creativity, personality, but they were quiet, manageable, no longer difficult or disruptive. For institutions, this was often considered success. Hydrotherapy was older but still widely used. Patients were submerged in ice-cold water for hours at a time, or wrapped tightly in wet sheets, which would shrink as they dried, becoming a kind of straitjacket. The theory was that extreme cold would somehow shock the system back to normal. In reality, it was torture disguised as medicine. Patients begged not to be taken to the hydrotherapy rooms. They fought, they screamed, and then they were strapped down and subjected to hours of cold that left them shaking, hypothermic, traumatized. We do not know exactly which treatments were used at Halcyon Hall. The records, if they existed, are long gone. But we know that private facilities had access to the most modern and most brutal techniques of the era. They advertised these treatments to families as cutting-edge, scientific, effective. And we know from survivor accounts of similar institutions across the country what the experience was like. The testimonies are remarkably consistent. Prolonged isolation in small rooms with no windows, sometimes for days or weeks at a time. Physical restraints, leather straps binding wrists and ankles to beds. Forced medication, pills or injections administered regardless of consent or side effects. Punishment disguised as therapy. If you broke a rule, you might be sent to isolation. If you protested your treatment, your medications might be increased. If you tried to escape, you might be subjected to more aggressive interventions. And above all,
Silence. Patients were discouraged from speaking about their experiences, even to each other. Sharing stories was seen as reinforcing delusions, as making each other worse. Better to stay silent, to keep your experiences to yourself. Families were discouraged from visiting frequently. The doctors would explain that visits upset the patients, disrupted their treatment, made them harder to manage. Better to stay away, to let the professionals do their work, to trust that what was happening behind those locked doors was for the best. What happened inside Halcyon Hall stayed inside Halcyon Hall. In 1978, Halcyon Hall closes its doors. After 31 years of operation as a psychiatric hospital, the building is abandoned once again. The official reasons given are vague and bureaucratic. Changes in treatment models, financial difficulties, new state regulations that would require expensive renovations, insurance reimbursement changes that made private psychiatric hospitals less profitable. But the truth is simpler and more sweeping. The era of large psychiatric asylums was ending, not just at Halcyon Hall, but across America. An entire system of care, or what passed for care, was being dismantled.
The deinstitutionalization movement was sweeping the country. Activists, reformers, former patients, and progressive psychiatrists were exposing the horrors of institutional care. Investigative journalists were publishing exposés. Courts were ruling that people had a right to treatment in the least restrictive setting possible. Large institutions were being closed. Thousands of patients were being released, often with little preparation or support. The idea was that community mental health centers would provide care, that people could be treated in their homes, in small group settings, with outpatient therapy and medication. It was a noble vision, but the community mental health centers were never adequately funded. The support systems never materialized. Many former patients ended up homeless, in prison, or cycling through emergency rooms. But that's another story. For Halcyon Hall, deinstitutionalization simply meant the end. The patients were transferred to other facilities or discharged, the staff were let go, and the building was simply abandoned. No grand ceremony, no commemoration of the lives lived there, the treatments administered, the people who passed through its doors. The locks were changed, and everyone walked away. For 4 decades, the building sat empty, a ghost on the hilltop, visible from the road but inaccessible behind fences and no trespassing signs. Nature, which had been held at bay during the hospital years, began its work again. Windows shattered in storms, ceilings collapsed under the weight of water damage, walls cracked and crumbled. The structure that had withstood the elements for nearly a century began to fail. Urban explorers began entering illegally, documenting the decay with cameras. Their photographs, shared on websites and social media, reveal haunting scenes that capture the public imagination. Rusted hospital beds still lined up in wards, as if patients might return at any moment. The mattresses long rotted away, leaving only metal frames covered in peeling paint. Medical documents scattered across floors, patient names and diagnoses visible on yellowed paper. Privacy laws meant nothing in an abandoned building. The secrets that were so carefully guarded for decades were now exposed to anyone brave or foolish enough to break in. A solitary wheelchair in a mold-covered hallway, its wheels rusted in place. Whose wheelchair was it? What happened to the person who used it? Did they recover? Were they transferred? Did they die there? Medication bottles on windowsills, restraint equipment hanging on walls, a hydrotherapy tub still intact, filled with fallen plaster and debris. These artifacts of treatment or mistreatment remained as silent witnesses to what happened there. It is as if the place was evacuated hastily, urgently, as if everyone simply left, leaving everything behind.
In reality, the closure was planned months in advance. But something about the scene suggests panic, desperation, a need to escape. Glasses on a table, one lens cracked. Reading glasses? Did they belong to a patient who loved to read, who found escape in books when escape through the doors was impossible? Shoes under a bed, worn and broken down at the heels. Size small, a woman's shoes. How many miles did she walk in those shoes, pacing the corridors, trying to tire herself enough to sleep through the medication fog? A forgotten Bible on a windowsill, its pages water-damaged and stuck together. Was it a source of comfort, or just something to do with the endless hours of boredom? Was it left behind deliberately, or simply forgotten in the rush to leave? These objects haunt the imagination precisely because they belong to real people. People with names, stories, families. People who laughed and cried and hoped and despaired. People who were loved by someone, missed by someone, remembered by someone. Or perhaps not. Perhaps some of them were forgotten long before the building closed. Perhaps their families had moved on, started new lives, pretended they never had a difficult daughter or troubled son. Perhaps no one looks for them anymore. In 2014, after years of legal battles between the property owner and historic preservation groups, Halcyon Hall was finally demolished. The preservationists argued it was historically significant, a rare example of Romanesque revival architecture, a reminder of the Gilded Age, a landmark that should be saved, renovated, repurposed.
The property owner argued it was too far gone, too dangerous, too expensive to save. The building was collapsing. The costs of stabilization alone would run into the millions. And for what? To preserve a building where terrible things happened? The courts sided with the property owner. Demolition permits were issued. It took months. The building resisted, as if refusing to disappear quietly. The brick walls were thicker than modern buildings. The foundations ran deep. The craftsmanship of 1893 was superior to anything built today. But eventually, piece by piece, it fell. The towers came down. The walls were pushed in. The beautiful architectural details, the hand-carved stone, the ornate brickwork, all of it was reduced to rubble and hauled away. Today, the site is empty, just a grassy hilltop with concrete foundations visible here and there. Only memories remain, and photographs. Thousands of photographs taken by urban explorers, historians, journalists, curious locals. But the story of Halcyon Hall forces us to ask questions that transcend a single building. How many other institutions like this existed across America? How many are still standing, forgotten, or repurposed? How many were demolished without anyone caring, without anyone documenting what happened there? The numbers are staggering. In the 1950s, at the peak of institutionalization, more than 500,000 Americans were living in psychiatric hospitals, state hospitals, private hospitals, sanitariums, asylums. The names changed, but the reality was often the same: isolation, control, treatment that often looked more like punishment. How many people were sent to places like Halcyon Hall, not because they were ill, but because they were inconvenient, because they didn't fit into society's expectations, because they made their families uncomfortable? We will never know the exact number, but we know it was substantial. Women who wanted careers instead of marriage, gay men and lesbians who couldn't or wouldn't hide their identities, people with disabilities who were seen as embarrassments, people with addiction who were seen as moral failures, people with depression or anxiety who were seen as weak. Many were committed against their will, many without legitimate psychiatric diagnoses, many for years, decades, or forever. And their records? Often destroyed. Privacy laws meant that after a certain number of years, institutions could legally destroy patient files. Most did, to save storage space and avoid liability. Their stories? Forgotten. Erased from family histories,
removed from photo albums, never spoken of again. Their voices silenced, both literally in institutions where speaking out was punished, and figuratively in a society that didn't want to hear about the ugly things we did to people we found inconvenient. Today, we recognize the horrors of the 20th century asylum system. We teach about it in medical schools as an example of what not to do. We memorialize some of the most notorious institutions. We listen to survivor testimony and acknowledge the harm that was done. We have made progress: community treatment, patient rights, informed consent, the recognition that people with mental illness have the same fundamental rights as everyone else, the understanding that treatment should be the least restrictive option, not the most convenient for society. But we still struggle with the same fundamental questions. How do we treat those whom society considers other, those who make us uncomfortable, those who don't fit neatly into our categories of normal and acceptable? How do we balance care with control? How do we provide treatment to people who may not recognize they need it without repeating the abuses of the past? How do we ensure that places built for healing do not become places of imprisonment, that medical authority is not abused, that families cannot simply warehouse inconvenient relatives? These questions remain urgent today. We have different systems now, but they have their own problems. Homelessness among people with mental illness, incarceration instead of treatment, inadequate community mental health resources, the criminalization of mental illness. We have not solved these problems. We have simply moved them from psychiatric hospitals to jails, to homeless shelters, to the streets. The story of Halcyon Hall reminds us that we have been here before, that we have made terrible mistakes, that good intentions and medical authority are not enough to prevent abuse, that systems that promise to help but actually control must be vigilant, questioning, skeptical of systems that promise to help but actually control. Halcyon Hall no longer exists, but its story matters. It matters because it reminds us that architecture is not neutral, that buildings carry purpose, and that purpose can change in ways their creators never imagined. H.J. Davison built a luxury hotel, a place of peace and rest. He died in 1909, long before his beautiful building became something entirely different. Would he have approved? Would he have been horrified? We will never know. But we know that a place built for peace became a place of control, that a sanctuary became a prison, that architecture designed to welcome became architecture designed to confine. And when Halcyon Hall finally fell, when the last walls came down and the rubble was hauled away, it took with it countless stories that will never be fully told. Stories of the people who lived there, who were treated there, who died there. Stories of families torn apart by commitment. Stories of lives interrupted, derailed, destroyed. Stories of resilience and survival, of people who endured and eventually escaped. Stories of those who never escaped. But perhaps that is precisely why we must remember, not just the building, impressive as it was, not just the architecture, beautiful as it must have been, but the people inside it. The lives lived in forced silence, the treatments endured, the years lost, the memories erased, the identity stripped away, the names removed from records and family histories. We must remember because they cannot speak for themselves, because their voices were silenced then and remain silent now, because forgetting would be the final injustice, the final erasure. Halcyon Hall no longer serves its original purpose. The building is gone, demolished, reduced to rubble, cleared away as if it never existed. But its walls still remember what happened there. Somewhere in landfills, fragments of brick and marble and plaster still exist. They absorbed decades of sounds, of voices, of footsteps. They witnessed everything. And now we remember too. We remember Halcyon Hall. We remember what it was, what it became, and what it means. We remember the people whose lives intersected with that building, for better or worse. We remember because memory is all we have left. Memory and the determination to never let something like this happen again. The hilltop in Millbrook is quiet now. Grass grows where Halcyon Hall once stood. Nature has reclaimed it, just as it tried to do during those long decades of abandonment. But if you stand there on a clear day, if you close your eyes and listen carefully, perhaps you can still hear echoes. Echoes of an orchestra playing in a grand ballroom. Echoes of wealthy guests laughing on the veranda. Echoes of patients shuffling through corridors. Echoes of voices that should never have been silenced. Halcyon Hall is gone, but we remember. And in remembering, we honor those who suffered there. We acknowledge what happened, and we commit ourselves to building a better, more humane world. A world where healing is truly healing, where care is truly care, where no one is silenced simply for being inconvenient. That is the legacy of Halcyon Hall. Not a building, but a lesson. Not architecture, but humanity. Not forgetting, but remembering. And in that remembering, perhaps we find our own peace, our own halcyon days. Better times, built not on the suffering of others, but on justice, compassion, and the recognition of our shared humanity.